What would you do if every single day you were treated like an outsider, like you didn't belong, like you were nothing, but deep inside, you held a secret that could change everything? What if the very people who laughed at you, pushed you around, and thought you were weak, were actually making the biggest mistake of their lives? This is the story of Jamal Carter, a boy who walked into Brookside High with nothing but his confidence, his silence, and a secret that no one saw coming. He was supposed to be an easy target, an outcast, just another name on the list of students who never stood up for themselves. But they had no idea who they were messing with. The jokes turned cruel, the stares turned into shoves, and when Jamal finally struck back, the entire school stood still. A twist no one saw coming. A lesson that would be burned into the mind of the most feared bully in school. Get ready for a story of justice, revenge, and the moment when a bully meets the one person he should have never crossed. Brookside is the kind of small town where nothing ever really changes. The streets are quiet, the same faces pass by every day, and everyone knows everyone. Here, people don't just look alike, they think alike, and when something different walks in, everyone notices. Jamal Carter wasn't just new, he was different. A black boy in a school where students of color were almost non-existent. And if they were, they stayed quiet, on the sidelines, never making waves. But Jamal, he didn't care about any of that. He had been through this before. His family moved to Brookside for his mother's job, and from the moment he arrived, he knew what to expect. The whispers, the stares, the unspoken rule that told him he didn't belong. On his first day, as he walked into the classroom, he felt the weight of 100 eyes on him. Some were filled with curiosity, others with quiet disdain. He didn't react. He found a seat in the back, away from everyone. Not because he was shy, but because he didn't need their approval. And it was this very indifference that caught the attention of the wrong people. The kind of people who saw bullying as a sport. Brookside High had its own hierarchy, a system that wasn't written in the rule book but was enforced in every hallway, every classroom, every lunch period. And at the very top of it all was Blake Harrison. Blake wasn't just the most popular guy in school. He ruled it. The son of the head football coach, he carried an authority that wasn't given to him by teachers, but by fear. People wanted to be on his side, or at the very least, they knew better than to stand against him. And he never worked alone. Ryan Carter, the right-hand man, the one with the sharp tongue, always ready with a sarcastic remark, designed to cut deep. Matt Douglas, the muscle, a guy who didn't need words, just his fists. Connor Mitchell, the master manipulator. He didn't just spread rumors, he orchestrated social destruction. And Chase Walker, the quiet one, he never needed to speak. His presence alone was enough to send a message. They weren't just bullies. They were the ones who decided who was accepted and who was an outcast. They didn't just insult or push people around. They broke them. And when Jamal walked into Brookside High, he became their next target. A new student was supposed to play by the rules, either try to fit in or stay invisible. But Jamal did neither. He didn't try to befriend anyone. He didn't flinch under their stares. He didn't lower his gaze when they walked by. He simply existed. And that was enough to set Blake off. The cafeteria was loud, filled with the usual chatter and laughter. Jamal sat alone at a table in the corner, eating quietly, detached from the world around him. He wasn't lonely. He wasn't nervous. He was just there, unbothered. Across the room, Blake watched. He had seen plenty of new kids come and go, but something about Jamal was different. Most kids either tried to impress him or tried to avoid him. Jamal did neither. He didn't care about Blake, and that was unacceptable. Blake stood up. The others followed. They moved as one, a slow, deliberate force making its way toward Jamal's table. Conversations in the cafeteria quieted as people noticed what was about to happen. Blake slammed his hand on Jamal's table. The tray shook, but Jamal didn't. No reaction, no flinch, just quiet, steady breathing as he continued to eat. Blake smirked. "Don't see you on the football team," he said loudly, his voice laced with mockery. "You know how to play, or are you just good at running?" A few laughs rippled through the cafeteria. Heads turned, students waiting to see how the new kid would react. But Jamal, he just kept eating. Ryan chuckled. "Maybe he doesn't even speak English." More laughter. Matt nudged Connor, grinning. Connor smirked. "He's just trying to act tough. But we all know guys like him aren't really strong. They just need to be put in their place." Jamal finally set down his fork. The cafeteria held its breath, waiting for his reaction. A retort, an insult, maybe even a shove. But instead he simply picked up his tray, stood up, and walked away. No words, no anger, nothing. Just silence. And that silence? It was the loudest thing in the room. For the first time, Blake didn't know what to do. He was used to people reacting. Whether it was with fear or anger, it didn't matter. He controlled the situation. But Jamal had given him nothing. Ryan scoffed. "Who does this guy think he is?" Matt shook his head. "I don't think he knows how things work around here." Connor smirked. "Oh, don't worry. He'll learn." But as Blake watched Jamal walk out of the cafeteria, a strange feeling settled in his chest. This wasn't over, and something told him that when it finally was, he wouldn't be the one standing tall. Blake wasn't the kind of guy to be ignored. Being invisible? That wasn't an option. And watching Jamal walk around like he didn't even exist? That was a challenge Blake wasn't about to let slide. "He wants to be different." Blake's voice was low, calculated, laced with something dark. "Then I'll make sure he stands out." Ryan tilted his head, chuckling. "You got a plan?" Blake didn't answer right away. Instead, he smiled, a slow, cold smile that sent a silent message. The game had begun. Brookside High had an unspoken hierarchy, and Blake sat comfortably at the top. Jamal? He was nothing. Or at least, that's what Blake intended to prove. If Jamal thought he could just ignore the rules, keep his head down, and walk through school like he was untouchable, then Blake was going to shatter that illusion. Not just for Jamal, for everyone watching. The first strike was subtle. A casual bump in the hallway, just hard enough to make Jamal stumble. Ryan played it off with a smirk, raising his hands innocently. "Oh, my bad. Didn't see you there." Jamal didn't react, didn't glare, didn't push back, didn't even mutter under his breath. Just picked up his pace and kept walking. That wasn't good enough. The next day, as Jamal opened his locker, water poured over his books, soaking the pages. Connor stood a few feet away, whistling, watching with amusement. A trap set, a reaction expected, but Jamal simply shook the water off and walked away, unfazed. That made them angry. Victims were supposed to react. They were supposed to flinch, get angry, fight back, or do something. That's how the game worked. But Jamal refused to play, and that made Blake's blood boil. So he escalated. Rumors started spreading, whispered stories laced with just enough truth to be believable. "I heard he got expelled from his last school for fighting." "No, man. I heard he almost killed someone. He's trouble. That's why his parents moved." Within a week, the whispers followed Jamal everywhere. Conversations stopped when he walked past. Students glanced at him with suspicion, wariness, but still, he didn't react. Blake felt something was off. Every target had a breaking point. Everyone cracked eventually. But Jamal? He wasn't crumbling. He wasn't even bending. Blake needed to push harder. That night, Jamal left the library later than usual. The campus was quiet, empty, the street lamps casting long shadows across the pavement. He walked at his usual steady pace, but something in the air shifted. He wasn't alone. Light footsteps, more than one person, following not casually, but deliberately. At the intersection near the sports field, Jamal stopped, not out of fear, but because he knew. "You think you can just keep ignoring us?" Blake's voice came from behind, smooth, almost amused. Jamal turned slowly. There they were, Blake, Ryan, Connor, Matt, Chase, 5 of them, blocking his way. Their expressions smug, predatory. Ryan grinned. "Don't worry, no one's around to see this." Matt cracked his knuckles, stepping forward. "Just a friendly chat." Jamal didn't answer, just looked at Blake, calm, silent, measuring. And that made Blake uneasy. He was supposed to look afraid. Blake stepped closer, voice dropping. "You're gonna learn to respect us." Jamal tilted his head slightly, the first real movement of acknowledgement. Not fear, not nervousness, just observation. Blake felt a flicker of something he didn't like. Then it happened. Faster than any of them could react, Jamal moved, a blur of precision. Matt lunged first, and in an instant, his wrist was twisted back at an unnatural angle. He gasped, a short, choked sound of pain, before Jamal used the momentum to flip him hard onto the pavement. The impact echoed in the silence. For the first time, Blake's confidence wavered. "What the hell?" Jamal stood there, completely composed, like nothing had happened. He exhaled softly and spoke for the first time. "I was trying to avoid this." His voice was even, steady. "But you're not worth being afraid of." The air shifted. The playful malice in Blake's group vanished. There were no more smirks, no more taunting grins, just silence and tension. Ryan hesitated. Connor took a step back. Blake clenched his jaw. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Jamal was the outcast, the loner, the easy target, but now, standing there in the dim light, he didn't look small. He didn't look weak. He looked dangerous. Blake had spent weeks trying to break him, and now, for the first time, he realized he had never understood who he was dealing with. Connor instinctively stepped back, his body tense, eyes wide with disbelief. This wasn't like any schoolyard fight he had ever seen. There was something different about the way Jamal moved, something that sent an uneasy feeling crawling up his spine. He wasn't the only one who noticed. Chase, usually quick to mock or jump into action, stood frozen. Even Blake, the self-proclaimed leader, had narrowed his eyes, his expression unreadable. Matt, groaning on the ground, clutched his wrist, his breath ragged. His mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. A moment ago, he had been the one in control, throwing his weight around, confident in his strength. Now he was the one struggling to get up, completely dominated in an instant. He didn't understand how or when it had happened, but there was no denying the reality before him. He had lost. Blake clenched his jaw, his hands balling into fists. This wasn't what he expected. He had assumed Jamal was just another quiet kid, someone too afraid to fight back. But now looking at him, standing there with that same unreadable expression, Blake felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Uncertainty. Jamal exhaled slowly, deliberately. He wasn't trembling, wasn't rattled. His movements were controlled, precise. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, yet carried a quiet intensity that sent chills through the group. "I tried to avoid this." The words hung in the air, making the silence around them even more pronounced. Jamal scanned their faces, gauging their reactions before continuing. "But you're not worth being afraid of." Blake's blood ran cold. He had been called many things before, but never had anyone spoken to him like that. Like he was nothing. Like he wasn't even a threat. For a second, no one moved. Then, ever so slightly, Blake stepped back. It was a small motion, almost imperceptible, but it didn't go unnoticed. Ryan and Connor exchanged a quick glance, understanding immediately what it meant. Even Jamal saw it, but he didn't comment. He just stood there, waiting, as if giving Blake a chance to make his next move. The tension was suffocating. Finally, Blake spoke, his voice cold and controlled. "This isn't over." Without another word, he turned, motioning for Ryan and Connor to help Matt up. Chase, ever the shadow, followed without hesitation. They walked away, their backs stiff, their minds racing. Jamal watched them go, his face impassive. But deep down, he knew this wasn't the end. Blake wasn't the type to back down. This was just the beginning. The next morning, Brookside High was buzzing. No official announcement was needed. Everyone knew something had changed. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said Jamal had knocked Matt out cold with a single punch. Others claimed he had taken down the whole group effortlessly. The stories grew wilder with each retelling. Some whispered that Jamal had military training, others that he was part of a gang. But one fact remained. Jamal Carter was not someone to be messed with. Those who once ignored him now watched him with cautious eyes. The students who used to laugh when he was harassed now stayed silent, uncertain. His presence carried weight, an unspoken authority that couldn't be denied. But not everyone viewed it as just another high school drama. Mr. Reynolds had been a teacher at Brookside High for over 20 years. He had seen his fair share of bullies and victims, of fights and rivalries. But something about Jamal stood out. It wasn't just how he carried himself, but the way he moved, the precision, the control. It was unlike anything he had seen in a student before, and it made him curious. That afternoon he found Jamal alone in the library. Without hesitation, he pulled out a chair and sat across from him. "I've seen the way you move," he said, his voice calm yet firm. Jamal didn't react immediately. He turned a page in his book, as if debating whether or not to acknowledge the conversation. But when he finally did, his gaze met Mr. Reynolds's with an unreadable depth. The teacher leaned forward slightly. "Where did you learn that?" A pause. Then, for the first time, Jamal chose not to deflect. He answered honestly. "My dad was a professional fighter." The realization hit like a ton of bricks. He had underestimated Jamal. He thought he was just another kid who got lucky. But now he knew better. Jamal wasn't some random underdog. He was a predator, trained and disciplined. And that made Blake angrier than ever. He couldn't let this stand. He wouldn't allow the school to believe he had been bested. No, this wasn't over. If anything, this was just the beginning. A plan started forming in his mind. A plan not just for revenge, but to put Jamal in his place once and for all. Blake had always been in control. He knew how to manipulate, how to break people down before they even had a chance to stand up. It wasn't about strength. It was about control, about bending people to his will before they realized they had a choice. But this time, things weren't going as planned. Jamal wasn't supposed to react like this. He was supposed to cower, to beg, to shrink under the weight of Blake's presence. Instead, he stood tall, his calm demeanor like a wall Blake couldn't break. And the worst part? The entire school saw it. For the first time, Blake wasn't the one holding the power. People weren't whispering about how he'd dominated someone. No, they were whispering about how he had been put in his place, about how he had lost. It was a shift, subtle but dangerous, one that threatened to unravel everything he had built. He needed to take control back, and he knew exactly how to do it. Rumors. They were his weapon of choice. A few words here, a planted idea there. Blake didn't need to scream or threaten. He just needed people to start asking questions, to turn their admiration for Jamal into doubt. Jamal's just scared. If he's really that strong, why won't he fight me? The words spread like wildfire, igniting conversations in the hallways, at lunch, in the locker rooms. Whispers turned into murmurs, murmurs into certainty. Suddenly, Jamal wasn't the guy who had stood up to Blake. He was the guy avoiding a fight, the coward. And Blake was in control again. The shift was immediate. When Jamal walked into the cafeteria, the looks were different. Yesterday, people admired him. Today, they questioned him. He could feel the doubt creeping in, the way people turned away when he caught their eyes, the murmurs just quiet enough to be heard, but never acknowledged. Then came the final push. Connor, always eager to stir the pot, made sure his words carried across the cafeteria. I guess some people are only tough when no one's watching. Ryan grinned, adding, or maybe they're only tough against Matt. You know, Matt's not exactly a challenge. Laughter erupted, loud and mocking. Jamal didn't react. He didn't need to. He had seen this before. This wasn't about a fight. This was about Blake trying to force his hand, trying to make him step into a ring Blake had already set up. Jamal met Blake's gaze across the cafeteria. He was watching, smirking, arms crossed like a king waiting for his subject to kneel. But Jamal wasn't playing the game. Not yet. Blake wasn't done. He needed one final move, the kind that would leave Jamal with no choice. And so, that afternoon, he made it happen. As the final bell rang, instead of letting everyone scatter, Blake stepped onto the sports field, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. Listen up, everyone. Silence fell almost instantly. It always did when Blake spoke. His crew, Connor, Ryan, Matt, and Chase, spread the word, pulling in more students. Within moments, the whole schoolyard was watching. Blake let the moment stretch before speaking again. We all heard what happened. Jamal Carter, the guy who took Matt down with one punch. A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. Matt stood off to the side, fists clenched, still feeling the sting of humiliation. Blake's tone shifted, challenging. But if he's that good, why is he avoiding me? The air grew thick with tension. Blake let his words settle, watching as the idea took root. Then he raised his voice, making sure there was no room for doubt. If Jamal is really as strong as everyone says, why doesn't he face me? Or is he only good at sneaking attacks in the dark? Whispers spread like wildfire. Some nodded, others hesitated. But the seed had been planted. This wasn't just a rumor anymore. This was a challenge. And then Blake saw him, Jamal, standing at the edge of the crowd, completely still, completely calm. He wasn't angry. He wasn't flustered. He was just watching. All eyes turned to him. The moment stretched. The entire school waited for his response. And then, finally, Jamal moved, slowly, deliberately. He walked through the crowd, stepping into the center of the storm, right in front of Blake. Their eyes locked. The air between them felt charged, every student holding their breath, waiting for the explosion. And then Jamal spoke. Not loud, not angry, just clear, steady, absolute. "I don't fight people weaker than me." A shockwave ripped through the crowd. No one spoke, no one laughed. The weight of his words was like a hammer to the chest. Blake's smirk faltered. Connor's mouth fell open. Ryan blinked in disbelief. Chase actually looked impressed. Blake had spent years controlling the narrative, twisting words, turning strength into weakness. But now? Now Jamal had flipped the entire game on him with a single sentence. He hadn't just refused the fight. He had dismissed Blake entirely. And worse, he had done it in front of everyone. For the first time, Blake felt something he hadn't felt in years. Powerless. No more quiet confidence. No more unwavering composure. Blake's hands clenched into fists, his heart hammering against his ribs, fury flaring up like a firestorm he couldn't control. He had been humiliated in front of everyone. The entire school had witnessed his downfall. If he didn't act now, in this very moment, he would lose everything he had spent years building. He wouldn't be the one in control anymore. Without thinking, without hesitation, he swung at Jamal. But his punch never landed. Jamal barely moved. A slight tilt of his head, effortless and precise, and Blake's fist sliced through the air, hitting nothing. In that split second of imbalance, he felt his arm being grabbed, and then he lost control completely. Jamal didn't hit him. He didn't have to. He simply pulled, using Blake's own force against him, redirecting his momentum with practiced ease. Blake staggered forward, unable to stop himself, and then he fell, right there, in front of the entire school. Laughter erupted, not from a few people but from everyone. It was deafening, merciless. Jamal hadn't needed to fight him. He had let Blake destroy himself. Blake lay on the ground, his pride shattered into 1,000 pieces. The laughter cut deeper than any punch ever could. This was something he couldn't just brush off or manipulate his way out of. This was real. This was permanent. From that moment, everything changed. No more subtle nods of respect. No more fearful glances from classmates. The power he had once wielded so effortlessly was gone. People no longer looked at him with deference. They looked at him with amusement, with contempt. He had lost something vital, something irreplaceable. And he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't reclaim his status with words or mind games. There was only one way to fix this. The oldest way. The most brutal way. No tricks, no calculations. Just raw, unfiltered violence. That night, as Jamal walked towards the school's bike rack, the air felt heavier than usual. Still, almost unnatural. The dim streetlights stretched long, distorted shadows across the pavement. Something felt off. A presence, a silent tension creeping into his gut. He slowed his steps. He didn't turn around, but he felt it. The careful yet unmistakable sound of footsteps trailing behind him. He exhaled slowly. "You think you can humiliate me and just walk away?" Blake's voice cut through the night. Low, cold, seething with restrained fury. Jamal didn't answer immediately. He took his time, inhaling deeply as if measuring his next move. He could talk. He could walk away. But from the way Blake's voice trembled, the way he was forcing himself to sound in control, Jamal knew. Blake had already decided how this night would end. So when he finally turned around, his expression wasn't indifferent anymore. Blake stood there, fists clenched, his entire body radiating pure, burning anger. Ryan stood beside him, shoulders tight, ready to back him up. "You really want to do this?" Jamal asked, his voice steady, devoid of any bravado. Just a simple question. Blake's jaw tightened. "I have no choice." And then he lunged. The punch came fast, fueled by desperation and rage, aimed straight for Jamal's face. But Jamal was faster. No wasted movements, no panic, just precision. A slight shift to the side. The punch skimmed past his cheek. And before Blake could react, before he could even process what had happened, Jamal struck back. A single kick to the stomach, not overwhelming in power, just timed perfectly, executed flawlessly. Blake gasped. The wind knocked out of him. He staggered, his body betraying him as he stumbled into a parked car, coughing violently. Ryan saw his chance. He rushed in, thinking he had the element of surprise. But Jamal had already anticipated it. In an instant, he spun, catching Ryan's wrist mid-strike. Ryan barely had time to react before Jamal twisted his arm, yanked hard, and sent him crashing onto the pavement. A solid, painful impact. A groan of agony. Blake, still breathless, looked up in disbelief. He had lost again. Worse, no one had even been there to witness it this time. There was no audience, no excuses, just cold, undeniable reality. Jamal didn't gloat. He didn't mock. He simply stood there, composed, his expression unreadable, as if he had already known exactly how this would play out. That made it worse. Blake clenched his fists so hard, his nails dug into his palms. Twice now he had thought his strength and status would be enough. Twice now he had been proven wrong. But this wasn't over. Jamal wasn't stronger. That wasn't the problem. The problem was that Jamal didn't see him as a threat. That fact burned more than any defeat. Blake refused to let this stand. He couldn't beat Jamal alone. Fine. Then he wouldn't fight alone. The next day he started assembling a team. Not just lackeys, fighters, the best. Jason King, the wrestling captain, a powerhouse of raw strength. Derek Lane, a brawler with a reputation for leaving people bruised and broken. Zach Torres, the quietest, but also the most dangerous. A fighter who never engaged unless he intended to finish it. Blake didn't beg. He spun his words carefully, feeding their pride, stoking their anger. He told them Jamal had humiliated not just him, but all of them. That if they didn't put him in his place now, he would do the same to them. They listened, and they agreed. Then Blake sent Jamal a simple message. No pleasantries, no threats. 5 p.m. after school. A real fight. Jamal's response came just as quickly. All right. No questions, no hesitation. Blake tightened his grip on his phone, a cruel smirk forming. This time Jamal wouldn't win. The clock struck 5 p.m. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the empty schoolyard. No teachers, no witnesses, just cracked pavement, overgrown grass, and a silence thick with tension. Blake walked forward, his crew at his sides. Jason and Derek, solid and imposing. Ryan and Zach close behind, forming a wall of intimidation. This time, it was different. This time, Jamal was alone, and this time, Blake was ready. As Blake and his crew entered the yard, he could already taste victory. This wasn't a fight. It was an execution. He had stacked the deck in his favor, ensuring Jamal had no way out. That sense of power, the one he had lost the moment Jamal humiliated him, was flooding back. Tonight, he would reclaim it. But then he saw him. Jamal stood alone, waiting, not leaning, not slouching, no nervous fidgeting. He wasn't just standing there. He was present, completely, utterly in control. His hands were tucked casually in his pockets, his expression unreadable. There was no fear in his stance, no sign of hesitation. If anything, he looked bored. Blake's stomach tightened. That wasn't the reaction he expected. He had brought an army. Jamal had brought himself. And yet something about the way he stood made it seem like he was the one who had orchestrated this, like he had planned for this moment. Blake shook the thought away. He had the numbers, the strength. This was already over. He smirked and took a step forward. This time there's no escape. Jamal exhaled, a slight shake of his head, as if Blake had just said the dumbest thing imaginable. Do you really think I need one? That single question sent a chill down Blake's spine. It wasn't cocky. It wasn't arrogant. It was just a fact. Blake gritted his teeth and flicked his gaze toward Jason. No more words. No more mind games. It was time to finish this. Jason understood immediately. He cracked his knuckles and lunged. Jamal didn't move. The instant Jason's fist was about to land, Jamal shifted, his body twisted, flowing like water, his movement so smooth it was as if he had seen it coming, seconds before it happened. Before Jason could react, Jamal swept his leg low, striking Jason's knee with precision. Jason's massive frame buckled, his balance stolen in an instant. But Jamal wasn't done. In the same motion, he caught Jason's falling arm, used his own weight against him, and flipped him effortlessly onto the ground. The impact echoed through the yard. Jason didn't get up. Connor rushed in next, trying to capitalize on Jamal's supposed distraction. But he wasn't distracted. He was ready. Before Connor's punch could reach him, Jamal stepped into his space, swiped his wrist aside, and slammed his shoulder into Connor's chest. The force sent Connor staggering back, gasping for breath. He barely had a second to register the pain before Jamal's foot connected with his ribs, folding him in half. Connor dropped. The fight had barely begun, and two of Blake's strongest were already down. Ryan and Derek, watching in disbelief, felt the unshakable realization settle in. They weren't going to win this. Not tonight. Not against him. Ryan was the first to crack. He turned and bolted, fear outweighing any misplaced loyalty to Blake. Derek hesitated for a second longer, his pride battling his instincts. But then he saw the look in Jamal's eyes, calm, patient, utterly unshaken. He ran. Blake's breathing grew erratic. His hands trembled at his sides. His so-called army had crumbled, and now only he remained. Jamal turned to him, stepping forward. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't taunting. He simply closed the space between them, each step landing heavier than the last. Blake wanted to move, to step back, but his legs refused to listen. His body betrayed him, paralyzed by the weight of the truth. He had never been in control. He had only ever worn the illusion of power. And now, that illusion had been shattered beyond repair. Jamal stopped just inches away. He wasn't gloating. There was no smirk, no sense of triumph, just an expression of quiet understanding. Blake swallowed hard, his throat dry, his fists clenched at his sides, not in preparation to fight, but out of sheer frustration. He had lost, and what made it worse, what made it unbearable, was that Jamal knew it before the fight even began. Then, without a word, Jamal turned and walked away. Blake stood frozen, breath shallow. He should have felt relief. He should have been glad Jamal didn't finish him off. But he wasn't, because this wasn't mercy. This was dismissal. The silence was deafening. Then slowly, from somewhere in the yard, a single person started clapping. Then another. Then another. And before Blake could process it, the entire schoolyard erupted into applause. But they weren't celebrating a victory. They were celebrating an overthrow. Blake didn't need to turn around to see the looks on their faces. He could feel it. No one feared him anymore. Blake stood there, surrounded yet completely alone. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, heavier than any fist that had ever landed on him. The faces around him weren't filled with fear anymore, only indifference, amusement, and worst of all, the kind of casual dismissal that made him feel invisible. He had once commanded attention, had once made people lower their gazes when he walked by. Now they didn't even care enough to hate him. Jamal walked away without looking back. He didn't need to. He knew it was over. Not because he had beaten Blake physically, but because he had taken away the very thing Blake had built his world around. Control. Power wasn't in his fists, wasn't in the fear he instilled. It had all been an illusion, and in one single moment, Jamal had shattered it. The celebration in the courtyard erupted, not just because Jamal had won, but because a reign had ended. For the first time in years, Brookside High breathed freely. The next morning, everything felt different. The weight that had hung over the school for so long had lifted. The echoes of forced laughter and cruel taunts were gone. The hallways, once filled with fear, now buzzed with something new, relief. Blake's presence had always been like a storm cloud hovering over the school. Now that storm had passed. He didn't show up. No one talked about him, at least not in whispers of fear. No one asked where he was because deep down they already knew. He was a ghost of the past. His absence wasn't a mystery, it was inevitable. Without his power, without his gang, without his dominance, he had nothing. The ones who had followed him, Ryan, Matt, Connor, they too had vanished. They had built their identities around being part of Blake's rule, and now, stripped of that, they were nothing more than shadows. They didn't even try to reclaim their place. They knew there was nothing left to reclaim. And perhaps the biggest change of all? The silence, the taunts, the racial slurs, the mocking laughter. They had all disappeared overnight. Not because the people at Brookside had suddenly become saints, but because the fear that allowed those words to thrive had been silenced, and no one dared to test the limits again. Not with Jamal still walking those halls, unchanged yet undeniably different. Jamal never acted like a king, never reveled in his victory. He didn't walk the halls with his chin high or demand respect. He didn't need to. He simply continued as he always had, silent, calm, untouched by the world around him. But now, that silence spoke volumes. It was no longer mistaken for weakness. Now it was a reminder, a warning that things had changed, and there was no going back. A week passed, and Brookside continued in its new rhythm, as if it had never known any other way. For the students, it was as though they had stepped out of a nightmare they hadn't realized they were trapped in. There was no more hesitation, no more forced submission, no more questioning who held the power. Because now, power belonged to no one. But while the school had moved on, Blake hadn't. He had spent the past week in silence, locked in his own mind, replaying that moment over and over. It wasn't the defeat itself that haunted him. It wasn't even the fact that he had been outmatched. It was the truth he had been forced to see, something he had never allowed himself to believe before. He had never been strong. Strength wasn't in the way he made others kneel. It wasn't in how he dictated the rules, how he controlled people through fear. It was in something else, something he had never had, self-control. He had thought himself powerful, untouchable, a force that could not be challenged. But Jamal hadn't just beaten him, he had exposed him. He had shown that Blake's power had always been fragile, built on nothing more than fear. And when that fear disappeared, so did he. And the worst part, Jamal never even needed to hurt him to win. He had never sought revenge, never tried to humiliate Blake, never even raised his voice. That was what made Blake feel truly small, because he had spent years trying to be strong, and yet he had never truly understood what strength was. Blake knew he couldn't hide forever. There was one last thing he had to do. It was late in the afternoon when he found Jamal, standing alone in the same place where everything had ended, the place that had once been Blake's kingdom, but had now become something else entirely. He walked up, no arrogance in his steps, no false confidence. He wasn't here to reclaim anything. He was here because he needed to say what should have been said a long time ago. He took a deep breath. Then, with more honesty than he had ever spoken before, he said the two words he never imagined he would say. "I was wrong." The words came out easier than he expected, but they carried a weight he had never felt before. He had spent years convincing himself that he was untouchable, that he was in the right, that he deserved the power he took. But standing here, facing the person who had never feared him, he finally admitted the truth. He had been wrong all along. Jamal didn't smirk, didn't look victorious, didn't revel in the moment. He simply nodded. No lectures, no gloating, no unnecessary words. Just a nod, as if he had always known that Blake would come to this realization on his own. Blake didn't know how to feel about it. He had expected something, anger, mockery, maybe even a speech about justice. But there was none of that, just understanding. And somehow that made it even heavier. As he turned and walked away, he felt different, lighter, as if the weight he had carried for so many years had finally started to lift. Maybe not completely, not yet, but for the first time, he felt like he could breathe. Jamal turned as well, walking as the opposite direction. No one else was around. No one else needed to be. Because some moments didn't need an audience. Some moments just needed to happen. Brookside High had changed, not just because a bully had fallen, but because the students had learned something far greater. Strength wasn't about control. It wasn't about fear. It wasn't even about winning. It was about knowing who you are, about not letting the world define you through hatred or anger. Jamal had never fought to prove anything. He had fought to protect himself, and that was why he had won. So now the question is, what would you do if you saw injustice? If you saw someone being treated unfairly, would you stand up? Would you let fear decide for you, or would you take control? Let me know in the comments below. And if you liked this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Because some stories aren't just meant to be told, they're meant to be remembered. See you in the next video.